You are listening to the 11th broadcast of TBR Radio Presents the TBR History Hour with your host, TBR contributing editor, Dr. Edward DeVries. In today's show, Dr. Ed talks with Paul Angel, executive editor of TBR Magazine. Ed and Paul discuss the March-April issue of TBR Magazine.
I'm always excited when a new issue of the Barnes Review magazine comes out, and the March-April 2020 issue is no exception, and as is our custom, today's guest is Paul Angel, executive editor of TBR Magazine, so that we can discuss all of the great articles that were in this most recent issue. I was afraid there was going to be a lot of background noise that was in this broadcast, and the reason why is we were literally having a new heat pump system installed in the building while we were recording the interview, but you really aren't going to hear a lot of background noise in this. If you hear a little clank or tink or bang or something in two or three little places in this, you'll know what that noise is. But there really wasn't a lot of background noise, so I'm thanking God for that blessing. But if you do hear just a little tinker or something, you'll know what was going on. At any rate, we had a great interview with Paul Angel, and we kind of began the discussion. We were talking about the coronavirus just because before we went on the air here, both of us just happened to be looking at coronavirus stuff, and that just happened to be where our conversation started before we get into the discussion of the issue of the magazine itself.
Funny when you listen to the news, they're like, oh, these conspiracy theories about the coronavirus, it's not some weaponized thing. And this doctor's talking about just the strange aspects of this particular virus that I'd never seen before.
It's just another strain of the flu that certain people are trying to create panic out of.
Well, I believe that too. When you look at the very fact that tens of thousands of people die in this country, anywhere up to 75,000 every year from influenza. I mean, influenza is a killer. Mm-hmm. People just aren't aware. And you think of all the attention we give to all this, and by the way, they think they're coming out with a shot for, it's pretty, I don't know. See, it's all part of the same thing, whether it's the police state, loves it, and vaccines, but that they could have a flu vaccine that could take care of 9 different strains. You got to take like multiple shots though. Excuse me, it's 9 shots, but you could take care of almost every flu there is. Now, do they want that? Oh, man, look at all the people that take decongestants and headache pills and whatever else they take, when they get a cold. What a big business that is. It is part of big business, that's for sure. And look at the way they're locking down these cities. Certainly is a great way to do the police state. But generally speaking, I don't think that I think it is being overhyped. I think people just need to get it and get over with it. The problem is, old people are really having a hard time with it. But they always do. It's nature's way of culling out the weak and old, I'm so glad I'm only 59 and a half. They said only people 60 and over have to worry about it. This guy I was just listening to says it's definitely not some bat soup. It says you can catch, this is so communicable that they think, and he's a doctor, and the other guy's a doctor. It's Mercola, so he's a little bit better than, say, Mike Adams nowadays is going nuts. But he says, for instance, it's so communicable you can get it from a pile of feces from somebody from 7 feet away, they think. I mean, that's pretty communicable. Right. And we also know that, for instance, like what they did to weaponize anthrax, right? Okay, anthrax was really, really bad and all this, but it wasn't that easy to get. And then they started thinking about like putting Teflon at the edge or whatever so that clumps wouldn't stick together and fall. They aerosolized it, So you never know. But the other thing is, sorry, I'm going to go back onto this thing, but if you were going to work on viruses and try to figure out about just trying to stop them, wouldn't you work on it in a bioweapons lab if that's what you had in the area? I mean, isn't that the natural place? I don't know if China has facilities all over the place for this or what. It's also kind of scary, the fact that we're still working on bioweapons in general. Human beings are going to kill themselves if Mother Nature doesn't do it, one way or another.
The cover issue was, something very, very different from what our readers are probably used to, the climate conundrum. And there is Ocasio-Cortez and that little mean girl from Norway or Sweden or wherever she's from. And who was the third person on here? I don't recognize.
That's Al Gore, of course.
Okay, wow, I didn't even recognize him there.
Yeah,
maybe because you got him in that Hawaiian shirt. But and you made his hair golden. Was his hair ever blonde? Did he bleach that or?
I don't know what he's done. He's going off the rails anyway. Listen, the climate article is kind of different for us, but in a poll we ran a year or so ago, people were asking for more on modern day tie-ins with history, and this global warming thing is a fascinating subject. It can be used, obviously, to get the UN and other global bodies inside your nation. It can get monitoring devices on our homes with smart meters and all this. And it really is a gateway into control for the police state. Are you using too much energy? You got to get rid of that car. It only gets 12.5 miles to a gallon. I see England, for instance, had passed some legislation that said they were going to get rid of petroleum burning vehicles by 2030. It's impossible to do this. So they're using this climate change and global warming issue as a wedge into your private life. What are they really going to do? We all know that, for instance, we're going to get back to the history of this in a moment. We all know, for instance, that it would be impossible, say, farm machinery to run on electrics, a tractor or something. They don't have the technology for it yet. And I see even the modern petroleum burning tractors are so complicated that they can't be fixed by the farmer, and they're extremely expensive with all these computer chips and all that. They've scrapped them, and they're going back to the ones made in the 70s and 80s that they can actually work on and repair themselves. So sometimes the technology isn't actually what it, and everybody knows this, isn't what it's cracked up to be. A buddy of mine is a real earther. Nice guy, thinks he's doing the great stuff. But he's got an electric car, and he got caught in a traffic jam recently. He had nowhere to charge the thing. So we're just simply not ready for it. I don't think we need it. And this article we have, our lead article, was basically the climate conundrum, what the real story is, and whether it's man-made climate change. Are these claims nothing but hot air? Well, let's admit the truth. The Earth goes in warming and cooling cycles and has been for billions of years. And much of it is inexplicable. It certainly isn't always tied to CO2, carbon dioxide, which is a product of trees and forests, right? And then they put out oxygen, and they love carbon dioxide, and they thrive on it. When carbon dioxide levels are high, plant life thrives. So that's a good thing, right? They're worried about cutting down trees and all this, which is a problem, by the way.
Well, you had even said, you had said that, the author of the article had said that deforestation of the earth is at an all-time high, and that's the result of the CO2 increases, and that we're also getting increased agricultural yields as far as food production and things. And so this is actually a good thing. It's not a bad thing.
Right. And what are the bad things? We know that and maybe we should touch on this later, but the bad things are cutting down large swaths of forests in, say, Brazil, and the rainforest can affect your climate in those areas. You don't want these guys coming in, and the black market guys or whoever's doing it, come in, these illegal loggers, and cut down huge swaths. It affects the ecosystem. It has more runoff. It's affecting the local environments there. That's a bad thing. We also have piles of trash, of plastic that are as big as the state of Rhode Island floating around in the Pacific Ocean. That's not a good thing. It's not a good thing that we throw dioxin and pesticides into our waterways, which are affecting the sexuality of not only animal life and frogs and such as we see this, but poisoning human beings. We know that defoliants sprayed on forests and jungles in Vietnam poisoned millions of people. We know that dumping depleted uranium weaponry on the Iraqis came up with some of the most horrific genetic deformities you're ever going to see. Those are bad things. Those are things we can control. What you can't control, and it's hubris to think you could, is Mother Nature. So as we go through this article, Mr. Ware, John Ware there, has taken us through the advantages of CO2, and also he's got good information there that CO2 levels are generally a byproduct, the result of warming, not necessarily the cause. And how do we know this? Because we have sedimentation layers of millions of years on the ocean bottom, in ground, in ice cores. And so they can trace this stuff back a long time. And so is man affecting the climate here? Probably not too much. Why do I say that? Well, there's times in the Earth's history in which we've had some catastrophic climate change well before anybody was burning fossil fuels. And one of those was the Permian extinction. And this was called the Great Dying. This was a time when the Earth rapidly warmed, the oceans specifically, and something like 94% of the animal life in the oceans died. And of course, this affected life on land as well. And they don't know, but they predict, and by the way, sedimentation levels in the bottom of the oceans are, when they sink so far down, are pretty much undisturbed. So they're a little better than on land, which is affected by erosion and by wind and water and such. But they predict that 94% of the land animals also died. Life nearly died. What happened? What made these oceans warm up so much so quickly? This happened in the course of several thousand years. And of course, it rebounded and it came back. Now, this was millions of years ago. But more recently, we can come up with some other dramatic climate change incidents in which no one has an explanation for. So let's look at, say, I always say this, when my friends are so worried about getting their electric cars and shutting everything off and not going to the gas station, whatever else they're going to do. They want to use the gas-powered lawnmower.
I was going to say, I just bought an electric lawn tractor recently, so.
That's okay. That's okay. Give that a shot and let us know how that goes in the future, when I'd love to know how that works and how long you can run it. I know my gas-powered weed whacker goes about 2 hours, 3 hours, and my leaf blower, but my electric one makes it about 15 minutes, and it's got to be recharged. So, but anyway, so let's go back to when the glaciers were here. I'm in like middle of Virginia, so the glaciers almost got here, and they were miles thick. This was 15,000 years ago, and so let's say they got past New York a little bit, almost to the Chesapeake Bay in some instances, and basically all the way across the country. And they were miles thick. And of course, this glaciation also took its way all across Europe. And this was the Great Ice Age, right? And then suddenly, inexplicably, according to science, because they have no evidence that would cause this global change, the glaciers started receding drastically. In the course of several thousand years or less, they had receded all the way, we'll say, from, and I'm going to give an North American example, but I could probably also say Spain to, Russia. But here it went all the way from here to Canada in the course of a couple thousand years. Now, these things are miles thick. This is well before we were burning any fossil fuels anywhere. What caused this massive deglaciation, the recession of these glaciers? Well, just as quickly, we have what was known as the Younger Dryas. And this is the glaciation period. By the way, we're still in a glacial age until every single glacier is gone. But there was the Dryas and the Younger Dryas, and this was the change from the warming trend back to the cooling trend. And all of a sudden, the glaciers were advancing again. And we'll say this was about 10,000 BC, maybe 10 to 11,000 BC. And this is all kind of estimates, but they know a little bit. And they also know that this was about the time the great Göbekli Temple structures were being built in northern Anatolia, or southern Anatolia, I guess it is, near the Syrian border, although they're all over Turkey, they're finding now. If anybody doesn't know Göbekli Tepe, you could probably go to the Barnes Review website at Barnes, BARNES Review.com, and look up Göbekli Tepe and find a very interesting article on it. But man couldn't explain it at the time, obviously. Here we were sophisticated enough to be building these pretty incredible temple structures, 10,000 BC, well before civilization was even supposed to be around. And they think it may have been a result of, wow, everything was going great here. It's been warm for a long time, and now it's cold again, and the bad weather's coming. What did we do wrong? It may have been the birth of religion in general from our ancient ancestors. That being said, we go back to the Younger Dryas, and of course that also began to recede again until the era of the mammoths was over. They did survive until quite recently in small areas like Santa Rosa Island off California, I believe, where they had the pygmy mammoth and other places. And of course, man lived at this particular period in time, and they don't have much of an explanation for it. What made those glaciers that were miles thick go back hundreds and hundreds of miles in the course of several thousand years? And of course, another inexplicable period of time was what's known as the medieval warming period. The medieval warming period, I'm going to say, it was about 900 AD to maybe 1100 AD. Could be off by a little bit there. But this was the time when the Earth the climate warmed again and changed drastically. This is what allowed the Vikings to settle Greenland. Greenland was actually much warmer then than it is now. And once that weather started getting cold again, those settlements died out. We have no idea what caused the medieval warming period. We do know that it was a great boon for the people of Europe at the time because they were able to plant their crops for longer periods of times and didn't have to worry about cold weather coming up and freezing the crops up. But then hits another inexplicable period of time, all within the last 1,000 years or so. This was about, we're going to say 1300 AD. But this period of time, actually, the little ice age, lasted for hundreds of years. And they think they know what may have caused this one. This was a cooling after this period that actually brought, I think it may have extended all the way from the 1300s to the early 1600s when we had this cooler weather. And we had snow in New York in July, back in the early days of the early days of this country. What caused that? Well, that may have been an explosion of one of these volcanoes in the South Pacific and the Krakatoa area, because that's extremely volatile there, right in the Indonesian area. And it threw up too much ash, and you get what we would call a nuclear winter, right? Everybody's always worried if we get a nuclear war, which is quite possible this could happen, that so much sediment and particulates would be sent up into the atmosphere that it would block the sun and cool things off. Well, once again, it reversed itself. And again, all these changes happened before man was building or burning a single fossil fuel. So really, they don't know. And they claim, the leftists claim, that this is all a byproduct of burning fossil fuels, and that man has done this all, and that the science is settled. That 97% of climate scientists agree that man has had a great effect upon the temperature of the planet. This is probably not true because, according to Mr. Ware's article, they only reviewed about 7% of the papers submitted to come up with this. And you see this 90% figure all the time. Al Gore says it. Little Greta says it all the time. All of them say it. And it's basically bogus science. As a matter of fact, hundreds of climate scientists have sent in papers and concerns up to the United Nations saying that they have seen absolutely no solid evidence that man has affected the climate of the world, and I believe it because it seems to be more tied to cycles of the sun, solar activity, sunspots, our elliptical orbit that might bring us closer. As you know, right, the center of this country, every 100 or so years, was prone to be turned into a desert. The Indians, even if they'd had the horse in the 1800s or 1700s, probably couldn't have settled most of the spots in the middle of the country because the large amounts of it were desert. Of course, that changes again. It becomes a grassland, and you get the Dust Bowl, right? The Dust Bowl was a warming period or a dry period of drought, and that's probably more dangerous than anything that we're coming across than the burning of fossil fuels. So anyway, very interesting article. I think you'll find that the science is not settled at all, and I think that man has probably had very little effect on the temperature of the planet. In fact, just recently they had to, and you've seen though, people are worried. They see the glaciers receding here and there. Like Glacier National Park had a sign up that said, "Enjoy these glaciers while they're here because they'll be gone by 2020." Well, 2020 is here, and they had to take the sign away because the glaciers are advancing again. So in certain places, it's actually getting cooler on the planet, and glaciers and glaciation in general are expanding. But nobody can doubt when they see glaciers recede for 50, 75, 100 years that the Earth has warmed and cooled. Mm-hmm. So I think only by reading that article you really get a good look at this. Nobody else is really saying it. Here and there they do. This was a fascinating article, and it's kind of it's got some great sidebars and other material in there, but it's one of the reasons people read the Barnes Review for the other side of the story.
Well, I know on one of the early pages in the magazine, we talk about Mark Morano's book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change, which we're selling at barnesreview.org. But $1 billion a day is being spent to prevent this basically invented crisis that, like you say, the science just isn't there to substantiate it.
We talk about this all the time on this show. The basic Bolshevik approach to destroying a nation or taking over a nation is destroy its religion, culture heroes tied to the past, present, and future, graduated income tax, right? Total control of all these different things. But one way to do it, they also want to separate you from your ancestors.
Now, hold on a second there, Paul. We'll get to that in just a moment. But first, let us cut for a break here for your and I's favorite publication, the Barnes Review.
Your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Okay, we're back, and we're talking with Paul Angel, executive editor of the Barnes Review magazine. And Paul, you were about to tell us how this whole climate change fiasco is linked to the alternate issue that we deal with so much on these radio shows, which is the overall corruption of our culture and, the bastardization of Western civilization and the attacks against our ancestors and all of those things.
For a little example, I walk into a dollar store around here one night, and I go up to the counter, and I don't know how the conversation came up with the gal. She couldn't have been more than 20. And it ended up with her saying to me, we were talking about pollution or something. Maybe it smelled like a diesel out in the parking lot. But anyway, she says to me, well, your generation ruined the planet for us. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, that's pretty communist. What are they doing? Well, here's an entire generation blaming the generations they came before for a non-existent problem. Just another way to separate them from their mothers, fathers, grandfathers, and to another way of social control, right? They're abandoning their family, tearing down their culture hero statues, telling people that religion is ridiculous and antiquated and all this stuff. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking not only is climate change a great way to get police state in your home, it's also a great way just to have this generation blaming. All right, you guys didn't know, we're idiots, this whole thing. And it kind of disturbed me in the fact that this global warming issue is being used, as leftists do use things like this to separate you from those things that ground you in your own past and your reduce pride in what we accomplished in the past. We all admit we made some mistakes, and I think we could be better caretakers of this planet and the animals on it. And I think it's important. I'm not exactly sure why, but personally, I'd hate to see the day that last rhino is gone or that last elephant is gone. And that is part of what we have done. We have changed the landscape of the country, of the different geographies around the globe. And it would be a sad thing to see that. On the other hand, who else besides the United States and some other nations have done so much to try to preserve what's left? There's some things you can't control. I don't think you can control the black market logging in Brazil. If the own nation can't do it, what are we going to do? You can't stop what Indonesia does in their country for chopping down ecosystems. But what we can do is put them in zoos or work to stop that, or stop, what do they call them, poachers, right, from killing thousands of rhinos, and there's very few left, I guess, maybe in the thousands, I'm not sure, for rhino horns. There's just some things we can't be that controlling. We don't want to get into people's business that much. But at any rate, I think this article is certainly worth a read.
It definitely was a good place to start the issue with, and something to get people's attention with. I noticed also early on in the issue there was a promotional article for another book that we're selling in the bookstore there at barnesreview.org, Dylan Howard's Epstein, Dead Men Tell No Tales.
The Epstein thing is amazing. When was it that he didn't kill himself? Just right. A few months ago, practically a year. But who didn't know this? No, that there was a blackmail op going on behind this, and that And then we also figured there was a Mossad connection. Now, I'm not sure if Howard goes into that, but he certainly goes into the idea that Epstein was running a blackmail operation, probably involving some of the most powerful people in the world, including presidents and princes and politicians and lawyers. And the minute that you saw Ghislaine Maxwell involved, you should have been a cue that the Mossad is probably involved. After all, her father, Robert Maxwell, the old publisher there, was a known Mossad asset, and probably also an asset of other intelligence agencies, possibly including MI5 or 6, whatever was around then, and maybe even the CIA. And so anybody doesn't know it, right? They get a politician in there, and maybe they even tell the guy the girl's 18. I don't know. But there's no checking. And the girl turns out to be 16. She's been, brought to the island to think she's going to be a cook or maybe a fashion model or something. Before you know it, she's been prostituted out to these people, and she can't get off. And Epstein's filming them with a clandestine camera, and they're being blackmailed. Who knows how many people are being blackmailed now in U.S. politics or global politics? You said to me off camera there that you believe that really wasn't even Epstein. Tell me why you say that.
Well, if you read the coroner's report and if you read the ambulance driver's report and the firefighters who were there to pick up Epstein's body and take it to the medical examiner and so forth, if you read their reports, they say things like a body that appeared, a body that looked like Jeffrey Epstein's, or what appeared to be the body of Jeffrey Epstein. These people don't write those kind of things in official reports unless they're trying to make sure that they cover, some future possibility, like in this case, the eventual revelation that really wasn't Jeffrey Epstein's body.
No, you're exactly right. Who knows what happened? I mean, it's hard to believe. Well, then again, let me backtrack. Is Epstein worth more dead or alive to the people who are running the op? Well, if Epstein goes to court and the Mossad is really running this op, do they want the truth to come out about their blackmail op or all the blackmailing information that they have? And these people, they lose their control on them when the truth comes out. They're just ruined. So for me, it would make more sense. Why would you keep him alive? Is my thing. He's not going to be able to do this anymore. I would have, if it was me running this op, I probably would have had him knocked off. I don't believe that he hung himself. And other experts have looked at the damage to his throat and other things, and it looks to me like they're making a convincing case that he was strangled, not necessarily hung himself, although when you hang yourself improperly, it is strangulation. But we're talking about just where the angle is and of the rope and where it would be making a burn mark and the angle of the damage to the throat. Looks to me like he was knocked off. So it makes perfect sense to me that he would have been killed. Why would you keep him alive?
Well, I agree. It doesn't make sense to not kill him, but at the same time, I guess that's what makes this so. And it could also be that this could be a distraction, of some sense. In other words, this could be the shiny object to have everybody looking in the wrong direction when they're trying to figure out the conspiracy. But
go ahead.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, there is no reason to keep him alive. But at the same time, and again, maybe I'm just going off on a tangent here that everything's been set up to make me go off on. But if Epstein was indeed an agent of a foreign government, as some have said that he was, is it possible that he was extracted so that they could kill him? In which case, then the Americans have to have some explanation, and so we put in a doppelganger, and.
I have no idea. What I do know is that one of them is left alive that was heavily involved with this operation, and maybe more than that, because I don't think just the two of them, Epstein and Maxwell, could have done it. But reports are that she was being held in a safe house in Israel on multiple occasions, being hip-hopped around. So she's still alive, and she may have a story to tell, and evidently we can't get our hands on her, nor do I know if the U.S. government really wants to get our hands on her, because it is to their best interest if they're being blackmailed to keep this whole thing up. Anyway, this is a great book. It looks like they've gone into not only a list of his crimes, his history, those who knew about it, but also the possible intelligence connection to a blackmail operation that would have affected hundreds of nations, possibly. So it isn't out of the belief. We know that these honeypot operations have been going on for centuries. Just that ever since they invented the camera, right, or the videotape or whatever, so they could film these guys or at least have witnesses. And of course, generally politicians who reach high levels have a lust for money, women, and power. So they know they can dangle these gals in front of them. It's a terrible thing. We know this is not just gals too, right? I mean, this pedophile ring involves homosexuals and weirdos of all kinds, of all stripes. We know it from our own history because of the Page scandal that happened back in the 80s in the Reagan administration, in which young boys were being pimped out to U.S. politicians. It's a sicko thing. And so you see people like you, people like me, we look at this and we're like, oh, come on, it can't possibly be happening to this. This is so sick. Man, the more that you see as it goes on and on, you realize just how depraved our leaders are, and the rich are, and the elite are, and those who can afford to dabble in such satanic things, that it's bigger than we could even imagine because it's just so far outside of our ken. That being said, I certainly hope, and I would love to say that there are some good politicians left in America that are not all involved in this, but nobody really seems to want to get to the bottom of the Epstein thing nor this pedophilia thing. And I have a feeling because they know that there's a lot of people involved in it, and it might be a longer going than we could have ever imagined as well.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
And refresh my memory here. Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, he was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Treasury or Assistant Secretary of the Treasury?
I think it was an Undersecretary of the Treasury. I'm not sure how many they had. They had one or multiple undersecretaries.
And he's a prolific writer, and his stuff appears from time to time in the Dixie Heritage Letter and in the American Free Press, and also this issue in the Barnes Review. And that was Dr. Paul Craig Roberts's article. Basically, he titled it "Rescuing the History of World War II." And he says that in an honest debate about Germany and Adolf Hitler, it's nearly impossible to come to a true conclusion on anything unless you turn to unbiased revisionist sources like the Barnes Review. And so he's basically not necessarily an apologetic for Germany or for Hitler, but, basically just explaining how all these years later, the false narrative of World War II, basically Western civilization is still reverberating from the shock of World War II and the whole false narrative of the history of that war is just making the effects on the culture and the society even worse.
Well, first of all, we love Paul Craig Roberts because he has credentials. But secondarily, as he's gotten older, he's been willing to talk about, I guess once he's got out of his paid professions, to talk about subjects that would have been taboo for him when he was in the government, including the Holocaust, World War II, Soviet Russia, white and black relations, the attacks on white culture today, the erasure of whites is one. But he found out that of the hundreds and hundreds of articles he had written over the past several years, that the most popular ones were on World War II, showing that people were extremely interested in the true history of World War II and a revisionist take. He knows, as well as you and I know, and our readers and listeners know, is that the victors write the history. They do it all the time, and of course they want to be the good guys, and everybody they defeated were the bad guys. But in a shameless plug for the Barnes Review here, he came across the book Germany's War by John Weir, and he contacted, it was actually American Free Press, because the Barnes Review had created that book for American Free Press to sell as a good, even-handed book on the subject. So it is available from both the Barnes Review and American Free Press. AmericanFreePress.net is where you'll find that. But he was very impressed with the treatment of sources, the number of revisionist outlooks, Suvorov, the Russian, David Irving, who's been suppressed, Harry Elmer Barnes, James Bach. These are like, I could name 10 more, but these are 4 of the titans of revisionist history from England, the United States, Canada, and Russia. And he requested permission for us to provide him with the text of the book, and he would put the chapters on his website and go over them one by one and review them. This particular article was his basic introduction to that series, which you can find on paulcraigroberts.com. I think it is his website.
PaulCraigRoberts.org.
.org. There you go. So it's www.paulcraigroberts.org, in which we just ran his intro. Doesn't talk too much about the book in general, but the chapter, every chapter in this 250-page book was gone over. He found it one of the most enlightening books, and it was quite nice for a group like the Barnes Review, for an organization like us, which is small, to have been recognized by someone of some stature, and to have John Weir, once again, I've mentioned him before, this book by John, to have been so lavishly praised. So we thank Paul Craig Roberts for contacting us about that. Of course, he isn't necessarily a huge Hitler fan. He does believe, and as the Barnes Review does, that Jews suffered during World War II, being rounded up and put in work camps, etc. But we were very happy to see this. I think it's worth reading. He has had an epiphany. He didn't know this. Here this guy's approaching 80 or somewhere around 80 years old, an extremely intelligent man who didn't know that there was other views about World War II. It just leads us to believe that there's other thousands and thousands of other people out there who don't know the true history of World War II, that don't know that the greatest slaughterers were the Bolsheviks there with their death camps, the camps that they ran, the Chinese, who also killed, the communist Chinese killed millions of their own people. Some say the estimates in Soviet Russia was anywhere from 40 to 60 million, basically white Christians. Nobody talks about that. Nobody wants to talk about it because, again, the victors write the history. Ergo, our ally, Stalin, had to have been a good guy because we never would have supported the wrong side in that war. So I think that's a great thing. Not only should you read this article, but you should get the book, Germany's War, the Aftermath and Atrocities. It's not the exact title, Aftermath and Atrocities of World War II. I think he covers it very even-handed. Whatever atrocities the Germans were responsible for, he covers, and the mass numbers that outnumbered the German atrocities were many, many more. The death camps of post-World War II, Germany run by Eisenhower and the French, were discussed by James Bach, and he was silenced, and his publishers were pressured not to publish his books. And David Irving, who talked about the Holocaust, who was sued and pressured and defamed and demonetized, deplatformed for talking about it. Harry Elmer Barnes, who was now considered an anti-Semite for talking reasonably about what happened in World War II. And Suvorov, who also was pretty much the Russian historian who proved that Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia by the Germans, was a defensive measure, not some attempt by the Germans to take over Europe. Quite the opposite. They hadn't done that. The Soviets would have marched into Eastern Europe and probably subjugated it much earlier than after Yalta, when we simply, along FDR and Churchill, just handed it over to them, which resulted in decades of more slaughter and more torture and more repression and et cetera, till that was finally overthrown, in the, I guess by the time with tearing down the Berlin Wall and Gorbachev and Reagan. Reagan's greatest accomplishment was such. So I think that's what you're going to kind of indicative of what you're going to find here. Paul Craig Roberts, I want to get him on the mailing list and let him read this stuff and see if he's going to have some more epiphanies, because most people who do read the Barnes Review either A, have an epiphany, or B, never want to see the magazine again because the stuff within it is so different from what they've been taught their entire lives. And believe me, we're even-handed, sometimes to a fault. And I think that it's great. It's tough to introduce the Barnes Review to people because it is so different. And we'll go on there, by the way, in the back of this article, back of this issue, there's another very good example of countering some World War II myths and lies.
Well, before we get to that, let's go ahead and pause here for about a 45-second commercial for our friends, the Sons of Confederate Veterans. Then we'll be back.
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
There was another World War II article on the War Plan Red where you show that, I say it's a World War II article, it was really a pre-World War II article showing that the original plan was for the United States to invade England and to attack England, and there were air bases and naval bases that were built back in the 1920s and 30s to facilitate U.S. attacks and invasions of Canada, Bermuda, British Honduras, which is now Belize, and even across the pond, if you will, into England itself. And that had this taken place as the bankers had originally wanted to see it happen, that we wouldn't have ended up at war with Germany at all, but we would have wound up at war with England.
It was interesting. After World War I, so we came over there and kind of saved the day for England, France, and others. The Germans never lost a battle in that war, and it was a stalemate on the front, the Western Front. But after the war, then England owed us a lot of money, and so we said time to pay up. And they said, well, what kind of, well, we can't come up with that. It's bigger than our GDP, what you guys have spent saving us. And so we said, well, how about, this interest rate? And the Brits were like, you're crazy. We can't afford to pay that. Well, how about we have the United States said, how about we have your allies pay? Well, no, they've been bankrupted from this war as well. So there's a little bit of problem going on there that they didn't want to give us all the money we had laid out on this. It was in the billions of dollars. And there was also then meetings about exactly, what levels of battleships and navies and land armies would have by the different nations. And Britain did not want to give up its naval superiority. And the United States said, look, we crank these battleships out like crazy. You see, in World War II, we were cranking battleships out fast. And so we don't want to have this naval agreement with you. Of course, there was a naval agreement between Hitler and England at one point in time, approaching World War II in the late 30s, I believe, in which Germany agreed to have some type of an agreement about the levels of their armies, because they had been prevented from having any type of defensive armies or building navies or anything after the Versailles Treaty. That being said, it got so bad, and Churchill hated the United States. I mean, you look at what his aides repeated that he had said about the United States. We were just arrogant, arrogant jerks and all this stuff, and we were unfair and all this other stuff. So we kind of thought maybe there was a chance we might go to war with them. Our original plan was to invade and take over Canada, hit Quebec, the Great Lakes, the prairie. We were going to come up through the center of the country, and we were going to do it quick. And we actually had a plan to use poison gas and drop it on some of their cities and just demoralize the Canadians to the point where they would have surrendered pretty quickly. It would have been difficult for the Brits to have stopped that, especially when we had built up special airfields. We had developed modern bombers and such. We had gone from the biplane to the monoplane and metal plane, wood planes to metal planes. And who knows how it would have turned out. It would have been a horrible thing. But the Brits then, they had their own thing where they were going to advance in here and probably try to take like Albany and take over Maine pretty simply. They thought.
I say there was even an offer they were going to give Texas to Mexico in exchange for the Mexican army invading the southern United States.
They even conned the Japanese into getting into the Navy and perhaps attacking California. So, and people say this is ridiculous, couldn't happen. Well, this is Army-Navy War Plan Red, and both nations have this on file. And finally, they were scrapped as World War II approached because we figured we'd have to go, and Britain would make a better ally. I guess the government decided, so the plans were shelved. But there they were on the table, and there are some people who think we came a little bit closer than they want to admit. Actually, this started back in the 1920s when the Naval Air Service of England had dispatched military technical missions to Japan to try to, in return for modernizing their Navy, they would in return then attack. And of course, the Mexicans wanted Texas and the Southwest back from the earlier wars that we'd had with them, in which we got that after the Mexican-American War. Anyway, the point was everybody thinks England is an ally that we'll never have and never give up upon. And there was a point there when there was a real good chance we might have actually come to a real live shooting war over control of the seas and control of the coasts. I always thought this was over-exaggerated, but looking at this article, it's absolutely not. Here these plans were on file and discussed and updated numerous times, how this was going to happen. And that would have been a horrible thing to see yet again. But you're exactly right. Who would have been behind this to have European and Americans fighting yet again? To have constant warfare. If this had happened, we would have constant warfare with our racial mates, we'll say, all the way from the early 1900s, all the way through, the wars kept going and going and going, didn't they? And World War II. All the way through World War II and the Korean War. The Russians were involved, but mostly we were fighting the North Koreans and the Chinese and the Vietnamese War and the French, whatever. So it's just a great thing that this was scrapped. But that is a fascinating article about a period of history and a plan that very, very few people know about.
And then the next article was American Foreign Policy from 1932 to 1940. A study in responsibilities, an American international decision-making through the eyes of historian Charles Beard.
Yeah, I won't even try to get into that one too good because in too much depth, because you have to read it for yourself. It's pretty sophisticated. It's a longer article, and it is through the eyes of Charles Beard. Charles Beard being one of the great revisionists of American history, although he had some upsides and some downsides, according to my readers who fussed about some of the aspects of an article about Beard before. He may have been a little bit socially liberal. That being said, he was a extremely learned man with a wide take on history. And in it, he talks about the FDR plan during his first term, his second term, what nations he was going to ally with, who was behind him, what their war responses might have been to the financial depression of the era, how they could pull themselves out of it, who were the people behind FDR, pushing him towards war or whatever. Of course, he got into office right promising he'd never get us into a war, and then did everything he possibly could to get us into World War II. And we've got little spots on Cordell Hull, and we'll have an interesting cartoon from Dr. Seuss, who was a big wartime propagandist and a big racist, and how they attacked the America First Committee, Charles Lindbergh and other American heroes, General Robert Wood and such, to convince everybody that they were just Nazi sympathizers and Hitler lovers, et cetera, et cetera. But that's one people need to read. That was written by Antonius Patrick, who extremely intelligent man, and he read this as a large volume of Charles Beard, which you gave the title of, I think, but it was called American Foreign Policy in the Making. A great book about a period of time, yet again, we don't talk much about the interwar period between World War I and World War II, and then the lead up to World War II specifically. And of course, we know Tansel, Charles Callan Tansel wrote the book, was A Backdoor to War, I think. And there was other books that were backdoor war, I think is that what I called it? Yes. Oh, by the way, Charles Coughlin was also vilified at the time and is still known as a horrible anti-Semite for his pointing out that many of the advisors around Franklin Roosevelt were Jewish and looking for a deal on the Holy Land and Zionism and the tie together with American foreign policy. And of course, then we had the book Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, and that was edited by Harry Elmer Barnes as well. All of it just talking about all the number of factors that go into our foreign policy.
And then after that, there was another article going back to World War II. Michael Walsh had written Letters from the Eastern Front, and he talks about how all the Soviets were saying that the Soviet Union and, communism post Bolshevik Revolution and so forth, that it was a workers' paradise. And yet the German soldiers who were riding home as they were moving their way through Russia during the German advance into Russia during World War II, they're riding home to their families saying that there are millions of people in Russia who didn't even know what electricity was.
Oh, it was worse than that. But basically, that was put together by Mike Walsh, who's written a number of books. He's a British nationalist, and this was actually a small selection of letters from a book compiled by Goebbels, I believe, to explain to people, those Germans who were still at home, who were still supporting Bolshevism, which there was a great number. Remember, there was a huge communist terror movement in the 20s and 30s there, and leading up to World War II, that thought that Germany should become a communist country. Walsh took some of the better ones. Now, they are a little propagandized, but they are natural letters. But a lot of them are just the flat-out recollections and eyewitness accounts of what, say, a German boy had been a farmer, or a factory worker, or a dairy guy, or maybe even just a clerk, what he found when he got to Russia. Here's this workers' paradise we talk about. And basically the thing was, Dr. Goebbels couldn't even have exaggerated what we found here. Farms in disrepair, people starving to death, women who would finally come out from hiding when they saw the Germans because they knew they weren't going to be raped. A great illustrated article. And they do all just say this is a worker's paradise was unbelievable propaganda. And so much of this was in the Ukraine, and after the German troops went into Western Russia from Operation Barbarossa. It's a great illustrated article. You got like German soldier giving a little Ukrainian gal a piece of candy, and you have women gathering around in their festive garb, their peasant garb, and so pleased to see somebody else. They were so hoping that the Germans were going to win the war so that Ukraine could restore its own sovereignty. Men were taken off by the Soviets and killed, tortured. They said they saw women, elderly, babies burned or tacked alive to church doors and such. The barbarity is out of control. One of the things I've noticed from my readers is that when it comes to these type of atrocities, you almost can't tell the entire truth because it's so emotionally overwhelming. So these letters discuss what they found in these cities, but not in such detail that you won't find this easy enough to go through, but still disturbing in the level of brutality that you found from the Soviets in the area. And again, even the German reporters would go in military garb. They're military reporters, and they'd pop in their motorcycle, and you'd see 7 or 8 Ukrainian women. He might jump off of his motorcycle and start helping them plow their fields. He might help them rebuild their house. They hadn't seen such kindness in years from any people in uniform. And their own people were just, the Soviet soldiers had been so dehumanized that finally the Ukrainians realized who the true enemy was. Unfortunately, Churchill and FDR didn't, and neither does today's modern mainstream news media, who still portrays the average German soldier as a anti-Semitic, kill every Jew I can get my hands on kind of guy, throw him in a gas chamber, slaughter them, slice them up, whatever you got to do. It's the exact opposite. The Soviets were the Soviet army was codified in their behavior and their regulations to rape every woman in sight, kill anybody who resisted. So a good little article and spoken in the words of the German soldiers who actually saw this when they went in there and what they saw uncensored and how glad that they were and how they wanted to tell everybody back home. You've just got to be happy with what's going on at home because you could have this if you don't watch out. And they would then also determine once they saw this to literally fight to the death against the Soviets to protect their women, to protect their children, to protect their homeland in Germany. So a fascinating little article, which I think people will really enjoy.
You know, you remember that song, that Bob Dylan song, John Brown Went Off to War, and he talks about how he looked into his enemy's eyes and he looked just like me. You know, I guess in the case of the German, army there, you know, they looked into the eyes of their enemy and they didn't see somebody that looked just like them. They saw, you know, usually you're hyped up with a bunch of propaganda about your enemy because obviously you have to hate your enemy or else you can't kill him. You know, what the German soldiers found was that they couldn't have made up propaganda. Their Russian enemy, in other words, their Russian enemy was worse than any propaganda could have painted them to have been.
Absolutely, and that was pretty much the point of the whole book that Goebbels put together, was just to explain to Germans that what they were hearing about, the level of barbarity of the treatment of the civilians in Ukraine specifically, was no exaggeration. And he didn't want to scare the population to the point where he told the whole truth. But these letters were just a nice recollection of eyewitness accounts of what they saw. So, yeah, you couldn't have exaggerated.
So we are just about out of time for this week's episode of TBR Radio Presents the TBR History Hour. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to cut the conversation there. Paul and I continue to discuss the remainder of the issue, and that will be our topic of conversation next week as we continue this conversation, as we continue this interview on next week's TBR Radio Presents the TBR History Hour. So be sure to tune in again next week, same time, same place. If that time and place just happens to be YouTube, be sure to click like and subscribe. And when you do, you'll get a notification when we post the continuation of this interview, and you'll get a notification each and every week when we post a new issue of the show up onto YouTube. Also want to encourage you to go to our website, www.barnesreview.org, www.barnesreview.org. All of the books that Paul and I talked about during today's broadcast can be purchased in the TBR bookstore there at barnesreview.org. You can also go to barnesreview.org and find out how, if you are not already a subscriber, to become a subscriber to the Barnes Review magazine. It will be one of the best decisions that you will make in your life, and it will be one of the best publications that you will ever be subscribed to. You will not regret subscribing to the Barnes Review, but in the unlikely event that you do subscribe it and then regret it, just let us know, and we will refund the unused portion of your subscription. And so there's nothing to lose here, folks. So be sure to go to barnesreview.org and check that out. I also want to encourage you to go to my personal website, www.dixieheritage.net, www.dixieheritage.net. And when you're there, I want you to sign up for my free weekly email newsletter, the Dixie Heritage Letter. Paul and I mentioned that briefly during the discussion. I believe we did anyways. And then also, I'll give you a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag, when you sign up. Another thing that you might want to do is email me personally, director@dixieheritage.net. director@dixieheritage.net. Email me personally. Let me know what was your favorite article in this past issue of the Barnes Review, if you read it. Let me know which, if maybe you just listened to the interview and you're saying, well, you know, one of the articles that you discussed just really struck me. Just let me know which one it was. And I would really like to know what our listeners are thinking when they read the magazine. Also, I want to give you something to look forward to. Next week, I will be recording an interview. It probably will not air for the next 2 or 3 weeks or so. But next week, I will be recording an interview, Lord willing, with Tom Goodrich, who wrote the article in the issue on kamikazes. And I don't believe that Paul and I got to that discussion on this week's interview. But next week, we'll probably be discussing Tom Goodrich's excellent article on kamikazes. But the author of that article, Tom Goodrich, who's a regular feature in the Barnes Review, will be my guest in an upcoming broadcast, and we will be talking about this article in the magazine. If there's another article in this past magazine that you'd like to hear about in more detail, again, send me an email, let me know. We want to get into the minds of our readers, and we want to give you the programs that you want to hear. And so, anyways, we are just about out of time now. But I do want to thank you for tuning in, and as always, it is my honor and my privilege to sit in this chair and behind this microphone, and I look forward to doing it again next week for you. Until then, from all of us here at TBR Radio, God bless. See you next week.